All right, everyone, welcome back. Here we are in our sixth lecture of chapter 16. We will be discussing the anterior pituitary gland, and after this we will have one more lecture in this chapter which will wrap up block 1. So, as always, let's go ahead and get started with our not really attendance questions. First, what do we call hormones that cause the release of other hormones? And second, what is the stimulus for T3, T4? Go ahead and pause the video, try to answer these questions. Now hopefully you've done that, and let's see what the answers are. So first, what do we call hormones that cause the release of other hormones? These are tropic hormones, or tropins. Now, tropic hormones are going to be a big topic in today's lecture. So if you don't remember talking about tropic hormones, we covered those in lecture 1 for endocrine. Go back and just do a little bit of a refresher there. And incidentally, there is something else that fits into this category that sometimes they're classified as tropic hormones, sometimes they're not, but they really are. And that is, there are some hormones that inhibit the release of other hormones. Now those are a special class, but they are really tropic hormones also. Next, what is the stimulus for T3, T4? Well, first, what is T3, T4? We talked about that back in thyroid gland, and T3, T4, two hormones released from the thyroid follicles. Collectively, they are thyroid hormone. So what is the stimulus for thyroid hormone? That is thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, and we will talk about that at length today. So previously we talked about the posterior pituitary gland and how it works with the hypothalamus. We said that there were two nuclei in the hypothalamus, one for ADH, one for oxytocin. They had axons that extended down through the infundibulum and had axon terminals that essentially made up the posterior pituitary gland, and as those neurons sent action potentials, ADH or oxytocin were released from the posterior pituitary gland, from the ends of those axons, into this capillary bed and then carried off to the body. Well, today we're going to be looking at the other part of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. And remember, the anterior pituitary gland is glandular tissue. It makes its own hormones, but it is still going to be under the control of the hypothalamus, just in a different way. So we showed this chart all the way back at the very start of this chapter, and now we're going to start putting it to use. This chart is found on the last page of your chapter 16 outline, and we're going to see exactly what it means and how we can use it today. But just to kind of give everyone an overview, this is called the hypothalamus-pituitary gland axis. And this is kind of going to work as a feedback loop. And what we see up at the top is the hypothalamus, and right underneath that is a row of hormones. Now these hormones are tropic hormones released from the hypothalamus. And these hormones from the hypothalamus all travel to the anterior pituitary gland and tell it to either release or, in these two cases, inhibit the release of the anterior pituitary gland hormones, which is this second row of hormones. So the first row of hormones from the hypothalamus tell the anterior pituitary to release or stop releasing the second row, the anterior pituitary gland hormones, which then go off to either have an effect directly on the body or release yet more hormones. So we will be talking about these today. But let's go back and look at the anterior pituitary. So, unlike the posterior pituitary, we are not going to be talking about neurons that have axons extending through the infundibulum into the pituitary gland. Instead, we are going to be talking about some neurons in the hypothalamus, kind of near the bottom rear portion. We would say the posterior inferior portion of the hypothalamus. They have axons that extend down into the infundibulum, but that's where they stop. Their axon terminals are in the infundibulum. And just very briefly, the way that these work is each of these little clusters of neurons will release one of these hormones. These are the tropic hormones from the hypothalamus. And depending on which cluster of neurons, we will get a different hormone being released from the axon terminals. So just like the hypothalamus did initially with the pituitary gland, we're going to have some neurons that send action potentials resulting in the release of hormones, but those hormones are released here at the infundibulum, and they get into this capillary bed, which then carries those tropic hormones through a vein called a portal vein and to another capillary bed at the anterior pituitary. Now, depending on which of these hormones was released from the hypothalamus, it's going to cause either the release of or the inhibition of one of the anterior pituitary hormones, which gets into this capillary bed and leaves to go off to have an effect on the body. So similar but different from the way that it worked with the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is still under control of the hypothalamus, just differently. Now, before we get into the hormones themselves, let's talk about the blood flow around the anterior pituitary, which is different from the blood flow of the posterior pituitary. So the red part is specific to the anterior pituitary. The black part, these are just body blood vessels. So we're leaving the heart in the aorta. We said that was the biggest blood vessel in the body. We're leaving the heart through the aorta. That blood that's going to go towards the pituitary gland first has to go towards the head. So blood branches from the aorta into the common carotid artery in the neck to the internal carotid artery, which is now going to go towards a specific part of the brain. From there, we're going to leave the internal carotid artery to the superior hypophyseal artery. That's what we see right here. So from the internal carotid artery, we're going to branch into the superior hypophyseal artery. Then we're going to pick up those hormones from the hypothalamus at this capillary bed here. This is called the primary capillary plexus. It's at the infundibulum. Now we're going to go through these blood vessels right here, leaving that capillary bed. This is called hypophyseal portal veins. The hypophyseal portal veins carry blood to the anterior pituitary. So now we're at the secondary capillary plexus. This is at the anterior pituitary gland. This is where the anterior pituitary gland secretes its hormones. We're going to leave this capillary bed through the hypophyseal veins. Then we're going to join the cavernous sinus, which is a vein, to the internal jugular vein, draining blood away from part of the brain, to the brachiocephalic vein, which carries blood back towards the heart from the head and the arm, into the superior vena cava, which then drains blood back into the heart. So this is the path of blood if we're talking about the anterior pituitary. So now let's talk about the actual hormones of the anterior pituitary. These hormones are the ones produced by the anterior pituitary. First, we have growth hormone, which is also called somatotropin. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also called thyrotropin. We have ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is also called corticotropin. We'll talk about these other terms in just a moment. We have gonadotropin, which is actually two hormones. It's follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they're released at the same time from the anterior pituitary, and collectively they are called gonadotropin. And prolactin. So these 6 hormones, GH, TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, and PRL, those are the anterior pituitary hormones that we see right here. Now, all of them are going to be stimulated by hormones from the hypothalamus or inhibited by hormones from the hypothalamus. So that's what this chart is. Hypothalamus, for example, releases TRH, tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, tells the thyroid to release T4. Or GnRH tells the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, which goes to the gonads and tells them to have an effect on the body. So that's how this chart is going to work, and these are the hormones that we're going to talk about. Now, to see that same information but in a picture format, one of these clusters of neurons from the hypothalamus releases GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, by sending an action potential, and then the GHRH is released into this capillary bed. It's carried in the bloodstream through these portal veins to the anterior pituitary gland, which responds by releasing growth hormone, GH, into this capillary bed, which is carried off to have an effect on the body. Now, the ones that have an X on them, these are inhibitory hormones. So, in this case, GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, from the hypothalamus travels to the anterior pituitary, tells the anterior pituitary, stop releasing growth hormone. Okay, so now we've talked about how the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland work together. Let's now talk about specific hormones from the anterior pituitary, what they do. And we're going to begin with growth hormone, GH. Growth hormone, it's a protein, it's an amino acid-based hormone. Its stimulus is GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. But if GHRH stimulates growth hormone, what is it that stimulates GHRH? So, backing up a little bit, the stimulus for GHRH is low levels of growth hormone. As growth hormone levels drop, the hypothalamus releases GHRH, which then tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. But there are some other stimuli for GHRH. For example, hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, increased blood amino acids, low blood fatty acids, and exercise. All of those things stimulate the hypothalamus to release GHRH, which then tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone is inhibited by a combination of the decrease in growth hormone releasing hormone and an increase in growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So as GHRH goes down and GHIH goes up, we stop releasing growth hormone. But what causes a drop in GHRH and a rise in GHIH? Well, first, negative feedback from growth hormone. If GH goes up, GHRH goes down and GHIH goes up. Also, insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. These are hormones that growth hormone actually stimulates. We won't get into a lot of information about insulin-like growth factors, but just know that they are very similar to growth hormone. Hyperglycemia, so high blood sugar. Hyperlipidemia, high blood fatty acids. And obesity. All of these things inhibit GHRH and increase GHIH. When that happens, it causes a drop in growth hormone. So what does growth hormone do? Well, obviously from its name we could tell that it causes growth. But how does it do that? Well, growth hormone stimulates anabolism or anabolic reactions. Remember from Bio 137, anabolism, anabolic reactions, those are reactions that build bigger molecules from smaller molecules. Anabolic steroids are often used by bodybuilders to grow muscle. So, anabolism, growth of the liver, growth of the muscle, indirect growth of bone. And I say that because growth hormone doesn't actually cause bones to grow. Instead, what growth hormone does is it causes cartilage to grow and it causes cartilage to be converted into bone. So growth hormone, increased cartilage, and cartilage conversion to bone, and the result is bones grow. Growth of most other tissues. It mobilizes fats for metabolism and spares glucose. What that means is glucose, which is our normal source of energy in the body, instead it causes fats to be broken down so that we can use those for energy in place of glucose. Growth promoting effects indirectly by insulin-like growth factors. So one of the things that growth hormone does is it causes the liver and some other tissues to release insulin-like growth factors, which also cause growth effects. Another thing that growth hormone does is it has anti-insulin effects, which increases blood sugar. So when insulin and growth hormone are both released, growth hormone kind of kicks insulin out of the way. It doesn't let insulin do its job. And remember, from the pancreas, insulin's job was to tell the cells to bring glucose in from the blood. Well, if insulin isn't having an effect, glucose remains in the blood and blood sugar goes up. Now, interestingly, growth hormone shortens the lifespan. Growth hormone is needed for growth and development, but at the same time, it shortens life. There is a species of mouse called an Ames mouse, A-M-E-S, an Ames mouse. And some of them are just normal mice, but some of them have a genetic defect to where they don't produce growth hormone. And when you look at them, it's obvious which ones are the dwarf Ames mice, because even for mouse standards, they are really small. But at the same time, because they're not producing growth hormone and it leaves them very small, it also almost doubles their lifespan. So growth hormone, yes, it's needed for growth and development, but at the same time, it makes you live a shorter life. So let's talk hypersecretion of growth hormone. This is typically from either a type of cancer that causes a tumor near the hypothalamus or near the anterior pituitary, or a blow to the head. So in either of these cases, the result is excess growth hormone. But even though it's going to be excess growth hormone, depending on when that growth hormone starts to be released in excess, what we end up with is either gigantism, if we have too much growth hormone from childhood, or acromegaly, too much growth hormone in adolescence. Now, we will come back to that in just a moment. Just know that gigantism and acromegaly both result from hypersecretion of growth hormone. But if you have hyposecretion of growth hormone, then you get something called pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is the result of hyposecretion of growth hormone from childhood. If you have not enough growth hormone as a child, then you are going to be very, very small. You're going to have some developmental difficulties. But if you have hyposecretion of growth hormone after adolescence, really not too much is noticed, because after adolescence, growth hormone typically drops off significantly. It's still there, but not as much. So, if you have me for Bio 137, you saw this picture already. But let's go over it again, especially for those students who have not had me before. What we see here on the left, we have two people. The man on the left of the left picture is of average height. The man on the right of the left picture has gigantism. And we can see the man with gigantism obviously is very tall compared to the man of average height. Over on this image on the right, we have two people that both are about the same height. They're both of average height. But the man on the right with the shaved head, well, there's something going on. It might be a little hard to put your finger on, but you can look and see there's something going on there. But it's not that he's any taller than the other guy. But instead, if we look closely, we see that his head, especially his jaw, is enlarged. He has a very large nose and some larger ears compared to the other guy. Compare their hands. Look how thick his thumb and fingers are. If he wasn't wearing this robe, we would notice that his elbows, his wrists, very, very thick. Same with his knees and ankles. They would be very, very thick. His chest would be very stout. This is acromegaly. So gigantism, very, very tall. Acromegaly, average height, but still enlarged. Let's use that as a thinking cap question. Now, if you're new to me, thinking cap questions are ways that we apply what we were just talking about, and what we end up with is critical thinking skills. We want to put what we just talked about kind of to the test. Do we know how to think about things, think things through critically to see if we understand what's going on? Now, thinking cap questions, they're not for any points or anything like that, but they are excellent bonus questions on exams. So you might see some of these again. Treat them like a quiz question. Pause the video, try to answer the question before going on. So, why does hypersecretion of growth hormone present as gigantism when it strikes in children, but the exact same thing presents as acromegaly when it strikes in adulthood? Let's go back to our picture here. Both of these guys have hypersecretion of growth hormone. The man on the left here, he had hypersecretion of growth hormone when he was a child. Over here, this man has hypersecretion of growth hormone, but it didn't start until after adolescence. So sometime in adulthood, he started having hypersecretion of growth hormone. Why is it so different depending on the age? Well, let's think about what does growth hormone do and what is significant about children versus adults. Go ahead and think about that. Pause the video, try to answer. And let's think about, how do children grow? Because that's what we're talking about, is growth in childhood. So how do children grow? What's the difference in children's bones and adults' bones? Well, there's a few differences, but the one that we're concerned with is the growth plate, the epiphyseal plate. In children, the epiphyseal plate is open, and they are still actively growing. Those bones are getting longer because of that epiphyseal plate. And growth hormone is pretty responsible for that. Growth hormone causes that cartilage to go through mitosis. And the more mitosis of that cartilage, ultimately more bone results. So longer bones because of growth hormone. But what happens around adolescence or late adolescence? Those growth plates seal. The epiphyseal plate seals up. And after that point, there is no more growth in length. That's what we have over here. Once those growth plates have sealed, it doesn't matter how much growth hormone is there. It's not going to get any longer. So when this guy had already stopped growing, then growth hormone started being released too much. His bones can't get any longer. But one, cartilage can grow. Bigger ears, bigger nose. And we also get thickening of bone. Bones can grow in width throughout your life. So flat bones, like the bones of the skull, still grow. The bones that make up the hand, the feet, the ankles, the forearms, things like that, they can still get thicker. So we start to see big hands and feet and big joints, but not any longer, just thicker. So growth hormone from childhood, gigantism. Growth hormone after adulthood, acromegaly. And it's all because of the growth plates. All right, now let's talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin. This is a glycoprotein. This is from the anterior pituitary gland, and its stimulus is TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. In infants, it's also stimulated by cold temperature. So TRH, or in infants, cold temperature, stimulates the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary. TSH is inhibited by negative feedback from T3, T4, thyroid hormone, or growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone can inhibit both growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. Its function, TSH, its function is that it is tropic to the thyroid gland. It tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone T3, T4. Let's look at the feedback loop here. The hypothalamus releases TRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which tells the thyroid to release T3, T4 thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, well, one, it goes to the cells of the body and has its effect that we talked about back in the thyroid gland. But it also feeds back to two places. It feeds back to the anterior pituitary, tells it to stop releasing TSH. It feeds back to the hypothalamus, tells it to stop releasing TRH. The result is we stop stimulating the thyroid gland and thyroid hormone drops. But what happens if there's hypersecretion of TSH? Well, this can cause a type of hyperthyroidism. If there's too much TSH, then we are going to stimulate the thyroid gland to make more T3, T4, which we talked about in the thyroid gland. If we have hyposecretion of TSH, well, we're going to have low T3 and T4. And depending on if it's a child or an adult, we get different outcomes. In children, we get something called cretinism. Cretinism is the result of low T3, T4 because of low thyroid stimulating hormone. Low thyroid stimulating hormone causes low T3, T4 in children. Low T3, T4 causes mental retardation. Short body, disproportionate size. So that means, yes, they're short, but some parts are shorter than others. Thick tongue. The tongue swells and it kind of looks like it's spilling out of the mouth. Thick neck. This can be genetic or it can be dietary. If mom, for example, is low on iodine, well, baby will be low on iodine also, if it's still in the womb. Or after it's born, it could have low iodine for whatever reason. Now, cretinism is not just because of low TSH. It's because of low T3, T4. But the low T3, T4 is because of low TSH. Also, myxedema in adults. We talked about myxedema in the thyroid gland. So if you have hypothyroidism and myxedema, we get decreased metabolic rate, chills, constipation, lethargy, and mental fatigue. All of this also is because of low T3, T4. So remember, what did T3, T4 do? Well, to sum it up, it increased metabolism. Well, if you don't have enough T3, T4, you're going to have decreased metabolism. Remember the calorigenic effect of thyroid hormone. Well, if you don't have thyroid hormone, you're not going to have the calorigenic effect, heat production, so you're going to get chilly. Constipation, lethargy, which is tiredness, and mental fatigue. All of that because of low T3, T4. So now, before we move on, let's talk about something that you're going to see, especially in lab, talking about primary or secondary disorders. And you will also see this when you move on into your program, especially if you're going into nursing. When we have this layout, the hypothalamus anterior pituitary gland layout, this type of feedback loop, what we have is the ability to have one of these things go wrong and it being a little bit tough to figure out which one. And what I mean by that is, let's say you do a blood draw on a patient and you see that they have low T3, T4. If you tried to figure out where was the problem, it's going to be very tempting to say the thyroid gland, because that's where T3, T4 comes from. But it could possibly be that the anterior pituitary gland isn't making enough TSH. If there's not enough TSH, well, we're not even telling the thyroid gland to make T3, T4, so it makes sense that it is low. So what we have to do when we do a blood draw is look at the thyroid hormone and look at TSH. Because if thyroid hormone is low, or even if it is high, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the thyroid gland. It could be doing whatever the pituitary gland tells it to be doing. If we take a blood draw and we see low T3, T4, and we also see low TSH, where's the problem? Well, in that case, it's the pituitary gland. Same thing if we see high T3, T4, sounds like hyperthyroidism problem with the thyroid, but it could be hyperthyroidism problem with the anterior pituitary making too much TSH. So you have to check both. And we call these either primary or secondary disorders. How do we find out what's primary, what's secondary? Well, start at the bottom and work your way up. If it's a problem with the gland, the thyroid gland here, it's a primary disorder. But if it's a problem with the pituitary gland, it's a secondary disorder. Now, yes, it could be a problem with the hypothalamus, a tertiary disorder, but we do not talk about that in this class. We're just talking about anterior pituitary and thyroid gland, or it could be the same thing with the anterior pituitary and the adrenal gland, adrenal cortex. So keep that in mind, primary, secondary. Primary is the last gland in line, first if you come from the bottom. Secondary is if it's a problem with the anterior pituitary. So, here is another way to draw out that same exact feedback loop. The hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone. Anterior pituitary gland responds by releasing thyrotropin, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which travels to the thyroid gland, who responds by releasing T3, T4, thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone goes off to the body to have its effects. It also feeds back to the anterior pituitary, tells it to stop releasing TSH, and to the hypothalamus, tells it to stop releasing TRH. The result is we stop stimulating the thyroid gland and T3, T4 drop back down to normal. This is our negative feedback loop for the thyroid. But let's talk about a similar gland. We're going to talk about ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin. ACTH is a protein. It's a peptide, but it's amino acid based. Its stimulus is corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. But what is it that stimulates CRH from the hypothalamus? Well, fever, hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, stress, and it's not listed on here, but also low cortisol. So what is going to be inhibiting for ACTH? Well, negative feedback from cortisol. When cortisol levels rise, it tells the hypothalamus to stop releasing CRH, and it tells the anterior pituitary to stop releasing ACTH. Now, the function of ACTH is it is going to be tropic to the adrenal cortex. We talked about ACTH when we talked about the adrenal cortex. It also has the ability to stimulate melanin. That's not really a function, but it can do that. It can stimulate the melanocytes to release melanin. And we will see that here in just a moment. So what we end up with ACTH, let's talk about this ability to stimulate melanin. Let's talk a little bit about Cushing's disease in just a moment. Let's look specifically at how ACTH is released from the anterior pituitary, because it's true to say that CRH causes the release of ACTH, but there's way more to it than that. Instead, CRH from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to make this hormone called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. Pro-opiomelanocortin, spelled out down here, this is how the anterior pituitary responds to CRH. CRH from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary make pro-opiomelanocortin. This is a big, gigantic protein in the anterior pituitary. And as soon as it's made, it's cleaved into 3 pieces. One of those pieces becomes endorphins. Endorphins are the feel-good hormones. When these are released, for example, when you eat chocolate, that also causes the release of endorphins. These are what make you feel good. Another piece is MSH, the melanocyte-stimulating hormone. Now, MSH, think back to Bio 137 when we talked about sun tanning. When you go out in the sun, the reason that you tan is because ultraviolet radiation from the sun damages the DNA of keratinocytes, those cells in your epidermis. And as that DNA damage occurs, keratinocytes release MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. That tells the melanocytes to start making melanin faster. As melanin builds up, it causes a tan, which blocks further ultraviolet radiation damage. But the other thing that is left over from the POMC is ACTH. So endorphins, ACTH, and MSH result from POMC being cleaved. Now, interestingly, MSH is destroyed. It never leaves the anterior pituitary. It's broken down immediately. Endorphins leave and help you to feel good. ACTH leaves and has the effect of stimulating the adrenal cortex. But let's talk about Cushing's disease. We talked about Cushing's disease when we talked about the adrenal cortex. And in hypersecretion, in primary Cushing's disease, there's that word again, it is the adrenal cortex is releasing too much of its hormones. But in secondary Cushing's, the anterior pituitary is releasing too much ACTH, which causes the release of too much of the hormone from the adrenal cortex. Now, what happens with ACTH and the other hormones? If we release too much ACTH, well, it's going to cause all of those Cushingoid syndromes. But at the same time, ACTH looks like MSH. It's shaped similar to MSH. What do we keep saying about proteins and their shape? If two proteins have the same shape or a similar shape, they behave the same. What did we just say MSH did? It stimulates melanocytes to make melanin. An interesting thing about ACTH is, well, normal levels of ACTH, they don't really do much other than stimulate the adrenal cortex. But if there's too much ACTH, as in hypersecretion of ACTH, as in secondary Cushing's disease, well, too much ACTH, one, it stimulates the adrenal cortex and we get those Cushing syndrome disorders, but we also start to see tanning of the skin. One, it's blotchy. It's not a smooth tan. It's darker in some places, lighter in some places. And two, the places where we see the tanning aren't necessarily exposed to the sun because it's not the result of ultraviolet radiation damage. It's the result of too much ACTH. So places that have been covered up are still tanning. That's one of the signs of secondary Cushing's. That's one of the signs of too much ACTH. So here's our feedback loop. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, tells the anterior pituitary to make POMC. Endorphins are released, MSH is made but never released, and ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, corticotropin, is released. It travels to the adrenal cortex, stimulates it to release aldosterone, cortisol, and the sex hormones. The cortisol feeds back to the anterior pituitary, stop releasing ACTH, and to the hypothalamus, stop releasing CRH. And that cuts off the loop. Okay, next two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They are two different hormones, but they are released at the same time. They are given the name gonadotropin. The two of them together are gonadotropin. Both of them have the same stimulus. They're released at the same time. The stimulus is GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. Now we're going to look at them separately because they behave different from each other. Follicle stimulating hormone, a glycoprotein, it's inhibited by negative feedback from something called inhibin and estrogen. In the case of females, in males, it's inhibited by testosterone. The function of FSH, different in males and females. In males, it stimulates spermatogenesis, the formation of sperm cells. In females, FSH stimulates the ovarian follicles to mature. And it stimulates the production of estrogen from the ovaries. Hyposecretion of FSH causes failure to sexually mature. Luteinizing hormone, LH, also a glycoprotein, also stimulated by GnRH, like we just said. It's inhibited also by negative feedback, but a little bit different. In females, it's progesterone and estrogen. In males, it is still inhibited by testosterone. So what's the function? In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone production by the testes, specifically the Leydig cells in the testes. In females, it triggers ovulation, the ejection of the egg from the ovary, and estrogen and progesterone production from the ovaries. Hyposecretion of LH, also failure to sexually mature. So here's the feedback loop for gonadotropin. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release gonadotropin, which is LH and FSH. LH and FSH travel to either the testes or the ovaries. The testes respond, the ovaries respond. As testosterone rises, as estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin rise, it feeds back to the anterior pituitary, tells it to stop making LH and FSH, and to the hypothalamus, tells it to stop releasing GnRH. All right, last hormone, prolactin, again from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin is stimulated by a decrease in prolactin inhibiting hormone. There is no stimulating hormone, releasing hormone for prolactin. Prolactin can be stimulated by TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, but really its stimulus is a drop in prolactin inhibiting hormone. Incidentally, prolactin inhibiting hormone has another name. Its other name is dopamine, which most of us have heard of. Dopamine is PIH. So if dopamine drops, prolactin is released. Some other stimuli for prolactin: estrogens, birth control pills, the act of breastfeeding, and dopamine blocking drugs. So, if you have a patient who is given dopamine blocking drugs for whatever treatment, it is not uncommon to have that patient, male or female, begin to lactate because they are producing prolactin. Inhibition. Prolactin is inhibited by dopamine, PIH. Its function is lactation. If we have too much PRL, so hypersecretion, we get something called galactorrhea. Galactorrhea is just excess milk production. But we can also get cessation of menses, so it could cause a woman to stop having her period. In males, it can cause impotence if there is too much prolactin. Hyposecretion is poor milk production. So if you are not making enough prolactin, then not enough milk can be produced. All right, so that brings us to the end of the anterior pituitary lecture. I know that one was long. The next one is the last one of this chapter, of this block, and it is much shorter, so that will kind of make up for this one being so long. If you have any questions, please let me know, and otherwise, I will talk to you in the next lecture.